Is up, YouTube? It's your boy Millzy. Welcome back to another episode of Millzy Revisits, the show where we join me as I go through my journey of reimagining, reviewing, and rebrewing all of my main decks, and then all the decks that were kind of in my test bench at the time. If you haven't seen any of the other revisits videos from the other main decks that I've done so far, you can check those out on the channel. But a lot of the concept behind this series is trying to re-examine the decks in my main deck box without being locked into any cards or any strategies or sub-strategies or that kind of thing. The goal was to reapproach the decks from ground zero and see how I would brew the deck differently now versus when I brewed the deck originally. A lot of these main decks have been around for a long time and they've had a lot of changes done to them. But what I was interested in mainly was, how is my deck going to change when I sat back down and truly considered new cards, different strategies for them, and shifting different things around. Today's episode is kind of what I consider the Bugatti Chiron of my decks, Imoti, Cascade. This deck is basically built to go as ham as possible. This deck is built to reach a level of play where my intention is to either bounce every non-land permanent that my opponents have back to their hand and win the game on attrition, or simply never let my opponents untap to win the game. The deck generally tends to build mana up, and so the way Imoti works is spells you cast with mana 6 or greater have cascade, meaning you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that has less CMC. You may cast it without paying its mana cost, and if you don't cast it, then you just put it and everything else underneath, or if you do cast it, you put everything you didn't cast on the bottom of your library, and keep going. What makes Imoti a really good commander is that, notice that it says spells you cast with converted mana cost 6 or greater have cascade. It doesn't say from your hand. It doesn't say from exile. It just says whenever you cast a converted mana spell with CMC 6 or greater, it has cascade. This causes what I've colloquially like to call cascade trains, where you start off with a very large spell, 9 or 10 mana, and you start cascading. Most of the time in this deck, you go from 9 to 7 or 6, and then because you are still 6 or greater, you cascade again, and you hit another spell that's 6 or lower, which means you wouldn't cascade again, but now you've cast 3 spells off of a 1, 9 mana, 10 mana, whatever spells. So that's the way that I built the deck to start with. That and I had a lot of ideas for the deck, and I think I've learned a lot of things over time. So what I'm going to do is, just like with all my deck techs, we're going to start down at the lands, we're going to work our way back up towards the creatures, and we're going to talk about how we fit these kind of into our strategy and kind of what's changed. Because the big thing here is not as much about what the deck does, but it's about how the deck's changed from the last time I built it. So down here, not a lot of the mana base really has changed. The big thing that's changed is adding Lotus Field, because I picked one up off of the 30th anniversary kit. I picked up the special version of it, so I've been trying to see if Lotus Field fits in any of my decks, and I think this is one of the decks that it fits well in, because we do want to kind of ramp up fairly quickly, as quick as we can. And I think Lotus Field does a really good job at that, tapping for 3 mana. At any point we get this card, I think it just transitions us forward on getting more and more value. The other thing that I did in this deck, a little bit more this time, was Nykthos is already in the deck. Nykthos Shrine of Nyx, which of course adds mana equal to the color of devotion of your choice. But I did add in Nyx Lotus as well. So Nyx Lotus is an artifact that comes in. You choose a color, add an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. You don't have to pay for Nyx Lotus every time you do it, whereas with Nykthos you do have to. But the difference there is, of course, you do have to pay for Nyx Lotus, and Nyx Lotus comes in tapped. So there is a downside, right, with Nyx Lotus over Nykthos. But again, I think both come in and help. We're playing a lot of permanents. This deck has a lot more permanents than it is spells. So the good thing about both of those is they're going to get better over time as we dump more and more things onto the battlefield. All right, let's get into our enchantments. The enchantments haven't changed a ton, but the one thing that did get added that I am absolutely in love with is one with the multiverse. Omniscience is already one of the win cons for this deck, because when you don't have to pay to cast spells from your hands, these giant spells that are going to go ahead and keep cascading, you're going to win the game eventually, because we're going to start hitting our extra turn spells. We're going to start hitting our copy spells. We're going to start hitting these great spells that we'll talk in a second when we get to the spells section. And I genuinely love Omniscience. It's a great card. It's one of those cards we want to find. What's really cool about Woman the Multiverse is we kind of get a second copy of it. Now, the second copy is a little different. We can look at the top card of our library at any time. This is actually great in a lot of ways, because this is going to give us a kind of a key understanding of what's the first card we're going to hit for the purposes of Cascade. If we're about to cast a 12 mana spell and we can see the top card of our library and it's a 2 mana growth spiral, then maybe we want to try to manipulate the top of our deck at all or something like that. It says you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. So this is cool because, remember, Imoti doesn't say where we cast the spells from. So the cool part is if we have a 10 mana spell sitting on the top of our deck and we want to use the cascade train from that with one with the multiverse, we could do that. And then once during each of your turns, you can cast a spell from your hand to the top of your library without paying its mana cost. So it's not Omniscience. It doesn't do all of it for free from your hand. But I think the really cool thing about one with the multiverse is there's going to be situations where this leads us to cast a monster spell. Some of those spells we'll talk about, like I said, in a second, for free from our hand, and is going to effectively win us the game just with the value that we save for casting it for free. And we'll talk about the spells that I mean in a minute or so here. The rest of the enchantments are here just to give us more value. Zendikar Resurgent here to double the mana that we get from our lands. This is just going to help us get into those bigger spells, and we don't even mind cascading into this. Garruk's Uprising, mainly here to help us draw cards when creatures come in. Garruk's Uprising gets even better once we have Omniscience down. Once we're casting these spells and loading things, and cascading and doing these things, this is going to help refill our hand and keep the train going. Shark Typhoon is one of our win cons. Whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we get an XX shark. The goal here is to make lots of sharks when we cast our spells and use those to help finish the game via combat. Concordant Crossroads is one of those things that's going to help us by giving all of our creatures haste. So that way, we have a giant board of sharks or plenty of or other things, or these creatures we just cascaded into, and then we can either play the Concordant Crossroads in our hand or cascade into the Crossroads, turn on our entire board to start attacking. When I say that the deck is meant to never let our opponents untap, it's meant to take a lot of turns, but the goal of taking turns is to get a board big enough to end the game via combat on those extra turns. I'm not playing a ton of fancy, gutsy ways to end the game. My intention is all of these giant creatures I'm going to show you in the creature section are going to come down and they're going to hit hard, but my intention is to end the game by taking 3 extra turns and dealing lethal damage over those 3 extra turns. I'm not going to manipulate the board. My goal is to end the game. At the end of the day, I think it'd be very easy with this deck to make the deck so that it just never ends the game. It is the opposite of my intention. I want to end the game, but I want to have some kind of fun while I do it. I'm going to just put a ton of fun things on the stack. We're going to have a ton of fun. We're going to put a ton of permanents down. This deck is fun because it challenges your brain on keeping track of the things that are going on, what's actually happening, and that makes me happy. Defense of the Heart is another really cool enchantment for this deck because this lets us go cherry pick 2 creatures of our choice as long as one of our opponents has 3 or more creatures, which is going to happen every game that you have this card. Defense of the Heart comes down to picking the right choices of creatures, and that's going to depend on what situation you're in. But most of the time, and I'll show this really quickly because in all reality, they're kind of the 2 you want. The 2 you want most of the time are Hullbreaker Horror and Brineland. Or Hullbreaker Horror and Tidespout Tyrant. It just depends on what you've seen already. But those are the 3 generally you mix between. Tidespout Tyrant says whenever you cast a spell, return target permanent to its owner's hand. Hullbreaker Horror says whenever you cast a spell, you can either return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, or return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then Brineland says, whenever it comes in or whenever you cast a spell with CMC 6 or greater, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. This is just going to help us start that kind of blinking our opponent's things get them back in their hands, get them out of the way for those attacks. And then we're playing stuff like Rhystic Study and Sylvan Library to help us kind of cut through. Survival of the Fittest was a new addition because I got one for my staple binder. It's probably not as good as I think it is in this deck, because as much as we want to pitch things and go get other things, I think I might rather just cascade into things. So Survival of the Fittest might end up coming out. It's in here because I want to try it. I've never had it, and I kind of want to give it an honest go. Coming up to the artifacts, you notice a lot of these are 4 mana, but there are 2 new additions besides the Nick Lotus in this version of this. Aetherflux Reservoir. I didn't think about Aetherflux Reservoir when I originally built this deck because I was just more worried about having fun, cascading into cards, putting out value. But the more I realized that Aetherflux Reservoir is actually pretty great, because let's have this scenario, right? Aetherflux Reservoir out. I cast a 10 CMC spell. Okay, gets put on the stack. I cascade into an 8, a 7, and a 5, let's say. Well, that's 1, 2, 3, 4 spells I've just cast, which means we're going to get that Aetherflux trigger, 1 for the first one. The second one's going to have 2, third one's going to have 3, fourth one's going to have 4. We've now just net 10 life in that one cascade train, and hopefully the reservoir now is going to gain us enough life to actually kill people with it, if that's or take people out with it. If that's the route we want to go. Chromatic Orrery, hoping to just get us enough mana again to keep pushing on those big turns, keep winning through. Lithform Engine, I really like the idea of, mainly because we can copy instant and sorceries if we want to. Extra turn spells, whatever it may be. The 4 thing can target copy permanents. We can put in 2 copies of mana rocks or 2 copies of different things, as long as they're not legendary, and kind of gain the benefits there. I love the idea of lithoforming a Shark Typhoon and getting 2 of them or some of our creatures and just kind of getting good values. But the one thing that I think I like Lithoform Engine for is Cascade's a triggered ability, which I didn't think about until I read Imoti again, which means Lithoform Engine can technically copy the Cascade ability and give you 2 Cascades off of a spell that time that you tap it. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think that's where Lithoform Engine is going to come in a lot of good, is copying the Cascade trigger on that big spell. I think the literal Magic Christmas land, the best thing I can think of is Apex Devastator, right? Cascades 4 times, Imoti makes it 5, Lithoform Engine makes it 6. Now you're cascading 6 times off of Apex Devastator, and it's very hard to not get good value off Apex Devastator when you cascade it. But again, I think the Orrery just makes it better. Or sorry, the Lithoform Engine just makes it better, and I think it gives more opportunity along the ramp up for you to get better value. All right, here's our spell suite. And you'll notice that our spell suite, it's going to anger some people, is a lot of extra turn spells. And there's a reason that is. And that's because, again, like I said before, we're trying to win the game. And we're trying to win the game by the method that I already said. And to do that, we're going to need to build. And building is always better when you have another turn. This is one of those decks where if you hit a Time Warp or a Temporal Manipulation off of a 6 mana spell, you now can take the rest of your turn to dump as much as you can on the battlefield to set up, untap for your next turn, and hit the Cascade train again and create more and more and more value. We do have to be a little bit careful in the spell section. You'll notice Awaken the Woods, Finale Devastation are both X spells, which means we don't want to cast them off the Cascade, because when you cast them for free off the Cascade, X automatically becomes 0, which means we get no value from them. But we can go ahead and just put them right back on the bottom with the Cascade ability, not cast them, and hopefully try to draw them somehow or something like that. We do have the Mystical Tutor as well. That way we can get these kind of out of the way if we know we're going to want them. Finale Devastation is one of the finishers in our deck, giving all those creatures haste and making them massive as well if we have a bunch of extra mana. So the bad part, of course, remember with the X spells as well, is that with Omniscience, if we cast them for free, X becomes 0. So we cannot cast them for free to win the game. But they will do, and I mean the pun here, they will do a ton of devastation in the way. I really like Awaken the Woods because I think in a world where you're putting 5 or 6 into X, you're making 5 or 6 extra lands and you're cascading off of it, means literally into your next turn, you now have 6 extra mana plus whatever you cascaded into to build value for the next turn. I think what that's going to do is just push you even harder into work your way into ending the game in all reality. One of the ways we prevent ourselves from looping ourselves into decking ourselves or making sure that we never hit a relevant card is Nexus of Fate. Every time we cast it, it goes back into the library, and it's going to make sure that we can never run our deck out. The thing with Nexus of Fate that we have to help us with that is Jadzi. Jadzi says we can pitch a card and bring it back to our hand. So if we get into the loop of having a giant hand and our library is really small and we're worried about decking ourselves, we can use Jadzi to just keep casting Nexus of Fate and run our hand out and win the game that way. So that's a little bit of protection for us. But you'll notice the spells on this list are either ramp, protection, or extra turns. Now the big couple of spells that we're looking for to help us in the game: Amanatu's Augury, exile the top 8, put a land from them onto the battlefield, and then for each non-land card type, we can cast a card of that type from among them without paying their mana costs. So sorcery, instant, creature, artifact, enchantment. Hopefully we hit all of them. Hopefully we can play all of them. Amanatu's Augury does a very good job most of the time at hitting us at least an extra turn spell, and if not, a ton of value. And this is 8 mana, and it's well worth the 8 mana because we're going to cascade off of it, which means we're going to get even better value off it. Now, the thing to remember about cascading is that you cascade before the spell resolves. So I can't Sensei's Divining Top or something like that to dump something on top for the Orrery to grab, because when the Orrery gets cast with Imoti down, I have to cascade first. It's not a choice. I have to do that first. Now, Sensei's Divining Top is an idea I've had for this deck because you can kind of manipulate the top of your deck. But I like the challenge of having to kind of brute force my way through the cascade to dump my value out and win the game. Expropriate, a lot of people hate this card, but it does a very good job. It's also 9 on the cascade meter, which means it's going to run into literally almost everything in our deck. So not only are we going to get an Expropriate, but we're going to get hopefully some more cards off of it. We're always going to get a turn with Expropriate because obviously we're going to pick time to take an extra turn. And even if everybody else picks money and we take a permanent they own and gain control of it, that's still net positive. We're still going to get a ton of value off of that, and we're going to use those permanents for our own good. Mnemonic Deluge is the one we really want. This says you exile target instant or sorcery from a graveyard, copy that card 3 times. You may cast the copy without paying their mana costs. Exile Mnemonic Deluge. If this card didn't say you can cast the copies without paying their mana costs, it would still be good, but it wouldn't be as worth it. But because that says you may cast the copies without paying their mana costs, it makes something like Time Warp, Temporal Manipulations, Walk the Ions way better, because then we get them 3 times, and for something like Walk the Ions, that's 6, which means we get to cascade off of all of them. Now you'll note that Temporal Mastery, Karn's Temporal Sundering, Alrund's Epiphany, Expropriate, these exile themselves after you cast them. So we can't Mnemonic Deluge those, but we can Mnemonic Deluge Temporal Manipulation, Time Warp, and Walk the Aeons. So that's why they're in there as well. And if there's any reason we discarded Temporal Mastery, Karn's, or Elrond's Epiphany, well, now we can Mnemonic Deluge those since they're in the graveyard. So Mnemonic Deluge is one of those big mana cards that just ends up being the thing that helps us kind of push towards ending the game. Because, I mean, I've gotten 4 turns off of Mnemonic Deluge. I've gotten 5, depending on if you're using different copy effects and things like that. And that tends to lead to ending the game. And then Mind's Desire, shuffle your library, exile the top card. Till end of turn, you may play that card without paying its mana cost, and it storms. And the storm is kind of ridiculous on this card. I've lost count of the amount of times that I play the Mind's Desire, and I go, okay, how many spells have I cast this turn? Because it's tough to remember when you're cascading and when you're playing spells. It's one of those things where you lose track. So if I have a Mind's Desire in hand, what I'll do is I'll kind of keep a dice as I'm running through my turn so that I know how many times I get to copy this. Now, the copies aren't cast, so we don't cascade off the copies. But we get a ton of value off Mind's Desire, and it just ends up leading to a lot of good things. Now we'll come up to the creatures. The creatures in this deck are all picked for two really good reasons: setup or giant creatures that just have great value. So let's go setup first, and then we'll go with giant creatures. Arithmeses comes in as a land with 5 slumber counters on it. Whenever you cast a spell, you pull a slumber counter off, and then it is a 12/12 Kraken, but it can still tap for 2 mana. This is a really card to get down really early. This is my favorite thing to cascade from Imoti into, because then you know that you're set up for your next turn. Beanstalk Giant is a 1 mana extra rampant growth on the adventure side, but then you get to put it down later for 7 mana as a star, where star is the number of lands you control. So I consider it to be more of a setup card than a finisher card. Other nice part here is, the bad part here is if you cascade into Beanstalk Giant, you have to play it on the 7 mana side. To adventure, you have to play it from your hand. So the bad part about Beanstalk Giant is if you hit it off of Cascade, you have to play it for its 7 mana cost. That's the only downside to Beanstalk Giant, if there is one. Gwenna, tapping for mana to cast creature spells, which we do have a lot of creature spells, and a lot of them are pretty high mana anyway. So Gwenna does help us a ton, and then it can untap and give us more mana. Rashmi, whenever you cast your first spell each turn, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card with CMC less than that spells, you can cast it without paying its mana cost. If you don't, you put it in your hand. This is just a little way to get some quick and easy, quick and dirty cascade trains in when you're casting other things. And Rashmi is well worth the 4 mana, because if you dump a Apex Devastator or Galta or Thrast on the stack, and we'll talk about why those creatures are so important in a second, and you're going to hit literally everything else in the deck, you're going to get that for free, and then you're going to start the Cascade train. And you can pick those triggers. So you can pick to have this go off before the Cascade train. You can pick this to go off after the Cascade train goes. You can kind of choose the way that you want it to work on the stack. But most of the time, I think Rashmi just is a net positive, because even if you hit a card that's more CMC, you just put it in your hand, and now you have another known quantity of something you can cast. And if if Rashmi's out while you have Omniscience working, well, now congratulations, you just got another card in your hand. Now, if it's a land, it just goes to your hand, and that's great as well. Sakashima is almost literally only in this deck to copy Imoti and get us more Cascade abilities. I've thought about Spark Double as well. I just couldn't find a spot for it when I did this list. I would like to work Spark Double back in, because it's never bad to have another copy of Imoti, especially since Imoti tends to get removed quickly, and it should. Want to have another copy of it. Selvala, we have a lot of big creatures in this deck because A, they cost a lot, and B, they're just generally good. So Selvala is always going to tap for some big mana, and we want that. That's pretty good. And then Uro's in here as is really in here as a ramp piece. It comes in, gain 3 life, draw a card, put a land down in it, and then it sacrifices itself automatically. But we don't even mind escaping this back later, just as a 6/6. That's going to be tough to deal with. Now, let's start with the really big creatures and why they're really good. Apex Devastator. Cascade is a triggered ability that goes on cast, which means that if you cast a spell and it has Cascade and someone counters the spell, you still get all the Cascade triggers. And I think Apex Devastator is one of the scariest spells in this deck, because I don't even care if it hits the battlefield. If I have a Modi out and I cast this spell, I am now cascading 5 times at 10 mana. And I probably didn't pay 10 mana, or I played very cheap to play this in the first place. Or if we have the Magical Christmas and having Omniscience out, I paid nothing for this. And I will gain literally more value than your counterspell did stopping Apex Devastator. This is one of the best creatures in this deck, and one of the creatures we really, really want. Astral Dragon. Astral Dragon was one of those creatures that I went back and forth on, because I think the upside is we get 2 copies of a non-creature permanent and they become creatures. But I think when you look at the Non-creature permanents we can make copies of. All of the options seem really great. We got to avoid legendaries, so we can't, do the Great Henge or Nyx Lotus or Lithform Engine or Orrery, but we could do Arcane Signet. We could do, Garruk's Uprising. We could do Shark Typhoon, get some more Shark Typhoons. A lot of great choices. An Astral Dragon, depending on what we have out, and at 8 mana, it already starts a pretty good cascade train when it comes down. We talked about Brineland, bouncing things. Craterhoof, here's another one of our finishers. Like I said, I'm looking to end the game by combat. Craterhoof's going to help me do that. Ghalta. Ghalta and Throst are two of the best creatures in this deck because depending on when we cast them, they can both reduce themselves to 2 green mana. So Ghalta says it costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control. Well, if we have more than 10, Ghalta comes down to 2 green mana, and on the stack, Ghalta is a 12 CMC spell, which means it's going to cascade into literally the entire deck except Throsta. It's gonna cascade into literally everything else, which means it's gonna start that cascade train, and hopefully it doesn't end quickly. Then it comes down as a 12/12 with trample, which hopefully we have a way to give it haste or something like that, and it just wrecks a bunch of stuff. We talk about Hullbreaker Horror being one of those things we really want to get. Hydroid Crisis is in here because we can choose the value of X, meaning if we go 4 or above, it cascades. But also, it draws us cards and gains us life. So if we have 10 mana to spare, nothing else to do, we have a Hydroid Crisis, dump it into this. X would be 8, we would draw 4, gain 4, and now we have a 10/10 sitting on the battlefield. And we've hopefully started a decent cascade train. We've gotten some value, and we just push the engine forward. Jadzi, 8 mana, 5/5. So the top ability is great because we get to pull it back to our hand and keep using it. But the bottom ability says whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. So this is why Jadzi is good, because of those Mnemonic Deluges, those kind of thing. Reveal the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card, you can cast it by paying 1 rather than its mana cost. If it's a land card, put it on the battlefield. So this is really cool because it's a Magecraft ability, which is going to go off every time if we're cascading into spells. This is going to happen. It makes the stack a lot less fun to think about, but Jadzi basically is going to not only help you get through your deck by cascading, but the crazy part is you start making like trees, like trees of a stack when you get to Jadzi, and you're like, oh, I have a cascade spell off of this. I have a cascade trigger off this spell, but I also have the Jadzi trigger. And you're like, I want to do the Jadzi trigger first, right? But then you hit another spell and you pay 1 for it, and you hit another cascade train. And it basically just becomes this ridiculous stack of spells. I literally wish there was some way in blue-green to dome people off casting spells. And if I could consistently, I would throw it in here. But that's why Aetherflux Reservoir is here now, because as you go through these giant stacks where you're gaining life for each spell you've cast before them, you just start pushing your life total higher, and Aetherflux Reservoir is going to end the game as well. Jimmy G, Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant, copies the first artifact instant sorcery we cast in our turn, counters the first one our opponents cast each turn. Jin-Gitaxias tends to help stop our opponents, and I would much rather have Jin-Gitaxias as the lightning rod than Imoti. And the cool part about Jin-Gitaxias is the first spell your opponents cast each turn, every turn, gets countered. So if they try to counter it on their own turn, if they try to get rid of it on their own turn without casting anything else, boom, that spell is countered. But of course, our opponents can use the stack to get rid of Jin-Gitaxias on its own ability, and cool. I'd rather have to eat 2 removal spells to get rid of Jimmy G than 1, and I think that's perfectly fine. Coma is a way to help kind of take over the game. If Coma comes out early and starts making serpents, you can just start locking down your opponent's permanents and their key pieces and not letting them attack. Now, it says its activated abilities can't be activated, so you got to be careful. You have to know the difference between triggered and activated abilities. Otherwise, Coma can be kind of useless. But the other good thing about Coma is you, hopefully with enough serpents, you just never get attacked, because you can just lock down the right creatures before combat. Your opponents want to attack, and you move on. Nyx Bloom Ancient, tripling the mana we get from permanence is going to help us end the game, and it's a not too shabby 5/5 as well. This is one of those cards that is another kind of defense of the heart target depending on where you are on the board state. Coming down and tripling every land you have is great. Coming down and tripling Nyx Lotus or Chromatic Orrery is not bad either. So this card can be really good depending on the situation you're in. Old Gnawbone. Whenever creature we control just come a damage player, we get treasures. Just going to help us take off as soon as it comes out. This is one of those creatures you don't mind cascading into. You don't mind casting it and taking an attack either. It gives us treasures, which just gives us value. Okay, Thrasta is in a very similar role to Galta, where every spell we cast before it reduces it by 3, so we need to either cast 4 spells or have any way to reduce this other than those 3 spells, but most of the time we will hit 4 pretty easily, especially during those omniscience turns. Comes in with haste. Again, it's a 12 CMC spell, so it's going to cascade into all the rest of our library except exactly Galta. And then it has hexproof as long as it enters the battlefield this turn. One of those big creatures we want to start a train with. Thrasta, Apex, and Galta are those fun ones you get to start the train with. And hopefully you hit some fun stuff. Thrix. Spells with CMC 5 or greater cost 1 less to cast and can't be countered. This is one of those cards that you want to land so that now you can start those chains off with big spells and really not be worried about what happens to the chains once they start. And it's also not a bad attacker at 4 or 5 with flying. It's just a good card. And no, it doesn't cascade by itself, but you don't mind cascading into it because it just makes your spells cheaper. And then Tidespout Tyrant we talked about with bouncing. So that is it, guys. That is my Imoti Cascade deck. The deck's a ton of fun, I'll be honest, but it is also... I understand why people don't like the deck. So it's generally one of those decks that if I bring to a shop or I sit down to play with people, I generally warn them that it's a deck that you're probably not going to... It's a ton of fun to watch happen. It's a ton of fun to play. I love handing this deck to people and having them play it because it's a complete mind wreck to try to realize how this deck works and how to function it properly. But I understand why people don't like playing against it. And so generally I like to give as many warnings as I can about what the deck tries to do, so that people aren't blindsided and that they know what I'm trying to do. And I have had a few opponents go, yes, I want that experience. I want to see what you mean. And they were pleasantly unhappy after that experience. But I think I keep this deck together because this is one of the decks that shows me how much fun you can have when you're willing to push what you want to do to the limits. This is not a CDH deck by any means. This deck is easy to stop because it takes me turns to get up to speed, and I need Imoti to do all of this. I need my commander to do all of this. But the thing is, I'm in Simic. I'm in this blue-green color combination where I can get mana very quickly, and hopefully Emoti's coming down turn 3 instead of turn 5. And the value that you're generating is by being ahead and getting more and more ahead. Still is stoppable. Imoti still dies to all your removal. It has no protection. I am playing Heroic Intervention and things like that, hopefully to protect my commander. But at the end of the day, you dump the commander, I lose some of that value. But the hope is that I get enough big pieces on the board that even if you dump my commander and I have to recast Imoti, I'm still generating enough value to keep at present, keep it going, and keep the deck running. So let me know what you think of Imoti Cascade down in the comments. Do you like this style of deck? Do you not? Again, I completely understand if you don't like this style of deck. This isn't my normal deck, but this is the deck that I've had a ton of fun with. And I've been searching a long time for another Simic deck that is a little bit more go-wide creaturey and having fun, because I know that, again, this deck does not jive with everybody that it plays with, but I love having it as my... party trick. If people want that experience, shoot me a like and subscribe, comment down below, let me know what you think, and I will catch you guys next time.